Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how I did this horse drawing in Pastels. Now as always, once I'd completed the background I started with the eye. Now in most cases, if there is some kind of reflection in place, I like to map that in first, and there was a bit more of a purple bluish tint here, so I started with those colours rather than white. Now if you do have a bright highlight in the eye, I would recommend to put the white in first, as we can always darken it with additional layers. It just ensures then that that highlight is as bright as possible, and we can always tone it down if needed. Now my main priority once I've done that is to get the main shape and size of the eye accurate. Now depending on the expression of the horse, the eye is going to take on a slightly different size. More nervous and excitable expressions may have more of an open eye, but when the horse is relaxed it's going to have more of a softer look, so I do want to make sure that I've captured that. Now in order to do this here, I want to be making sure that I'm not forcing highlights where they shouldn't be, and I want to be making sure that I've got the contrast correct. Now this relies on good shading, making sure that I've got my lights and my darks accurate. Now the eye here was actually very dark, so I didn't want to force too many highlights where they shouldn't be, because the light was not able to hit all of the surfaces of the eye, it just was catching more of the top. So here I want to be making sure that I'm not forcing too much of a vibrant colour, as that would also influence more of that light source. Paying real close attention to the reference photo here is crucial. Now in cases where the eyes are really dark, it can feel tempting to add more detail than we can actually see. But you want to be making sure that we've got that balance just right, otherwise too many details, more of those brighter highlights, will change the expression entirely. Now when it came to working on the rest of the face, this is where the base layer process is crucial. Now here I'm using a combination of my Caran, Carbothello, Pitt and Derwent pastel pencils. My preference here was to work just with pastel pencils rather than a pan pastel base layer, but this is optional. I do prefer when working on horse portraits to have more of that ultimate control at my base layer stage, so that I can capture any tiny alteration in the lights and the darks. Now the reason for horses being more of this specific application is just because they have more of a thinner skin, so you are able to see more of the individual structures such as the small veins, the additional bony features under the skin and the muscles. Like the cheekbone here. This is one of those key areas where I want to make sure I've got that exactly in the right place, and using my pastel pencils enables that. Now if you are using pan pastels for your base layer, I would recommend to make sure you're using not too much to avoid filling the tooth of the paper. Now if you fill the tooth of the paper, the pastel pencils will feel very slippery, almost like they're gliding over the top of the pastel. If that has happened, then too much of the pastel has been applied early on. Now a general guideline here that I usually follow is when you are using your pan pastels or your soft pastel sticks, that you should be able to see your white sketch lines or your white transfer lines through that layer for your base. This enables then that we're not going to have the issue of filling the tooth of the paper because you've got plenty left to work with. Now a key stage of any drawing is the layering process. So at this point here where I start to use more of my lighter colours, I'm making sure that I don't jump into my brightest highlights first. Now a big aspect of this is making sure that your base layers are dark enough. Now at times here I actually am also using the Cretacolor black pencil, and that enables me to get my colours much darker without losing the colour saturation that I've started to add at that very first layer. Now being able to keep this balance just right is all in how we use the pencils and build up those layers. This is a key focus in the real-time step-by-step version of this tutorial. If that is of interest, I'll link the information to that in the description below. Now at this stage here, I really want to be focusing again on the light source. Where are there some particularly brighter highlights? Where is the darker shadows? And making sure that I'm evaluating that in the entire reference photo. Now my preference is to work in small sections. As you can see, I get that about 90% complete and then I move on. I can always come back to these areas once the entire drawing is in place. But making sure here that I'm working with the correct value and contrast is going to really enhance the shape and form. Now if I add too many bright highlights where they're not needed, I can actually give the indication that there's more lumps and bumps under the skin, and very quickly that portrait is not going to resemble as much like that animal as it should. So this is why the placement of the highlights and shadows, the contrast, everything here regarding the values is just as important as worrying about the pencils to use, how much detail we should be including, and so on. Now, when aiming for a high level of realism, it is about getting the balance of everything just right. We don't want to be focusing on one aspect more so than the other, because everything here is influenced. Now, one key aspect of this is to make sure that we don't add too many obvious pencil details that we feel will make it look more realistic. This is one of the common mistakes when working with realism with horse portraits. If we add too many individual lines, we can actually make that fur look quite fluffy or too coarse if the details don't have softness. As more of this portrait develops, you'll see that it's more about the softness of the values rather than forcing in lots of individual lines. Now, there are areas where I'm going to add more detail, but they still have a lot of softness, and that starts at that base layer foundation. This really is such a key part when drawing horse portraits and aiming for a very high level of realism, as I am here. Now, this area on the cheek, for example, is a great example of that. This area here is where the hair gets a little bit longer, but I don't want to force those pencil strokes so that they look too wiry. I want to still be having that initial base foundation and building up all of those layers, my values and colours, before I start adding in my details. Now, adding in details too soon, just as like jumping into the brightest highlights too soon, can really affect what that portrait looks like when finished. Now, if you feel your pencil strokes are too harsh, I would work with more of a mid-tone, softer layer first and then come back to that colour. It can add so much additional depth to the portrait. Now, when it came to working on the nose and the muzzle area, this is where again I want to focus on making sure I've got my main lights and darks in the right place. Now, regardless of the nose that I'm drawing, I will always map in the nostrils first. The placement of the nostrils are very obvious if they're not correct, even if someone doesn't have the reference photo. So this is usually where I'll start, regardless, as I say, of the animal that I'm drawing. Then I can start to map in where the mouth is, the separation between the top lip and the bottom lip. This again gives me a key area that I can then work up against, and I can really tell here the two differences between those facial features. Just having this in place and mapping this in initially means that we're more likely to follow that reference photo more accurately. Now, just like when we draw fur or hair, the base layers when drawing skin are just as crucial. Now, any harsh edges between the lights and the darks, such as on the curve of the nostril here, they're going to give more of a two-dimensional look if that is left in the portrait. So at this stage, when I've got my lighter and darker colours side by side, I'll usually then come in and soften those areas, even if it is just slightly. Now, very rarely would I leave those two areas completely harsh with no blending, because as I say, that's usually going to give more of a harsher look to the face. So I want to be still here focusing on my softness before I consider any kind of detail. Now, one aspect about using pastels that can be quite tricky is avoiding muddy colours. Now, this usually happens if the layering process is incorrect. So when I work with colours that are more brown, reds, yellows or oranges, I'll work with more of a conservative layering approach to make sure that I don't make my base layers too dark. I'll add in my darker values at more specific points in the layering process to make sure that I don't have any of those muddy colours occur. And again, this is another key area that I do focus on in the real-time version of this tutorial. Now, at this point here on the horse portrait between the cheek and the nose, the hair direction can end up sometimes looking a little bit too flat if the pencil strokes are moved all in the same way. Now, hair or fur direction is a massive consideration when aiming for realism. The fur direction, just like the placement of the highlights and shadows, is never random. It follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. Now, this section that I'm working on here, this is actually where the tongue would be under the skin. I want to be making sure that I've captured almost a slight curved, maybe a bulge type look that has this indication of what might be underneath it. Now, in order to do that, the placement of the highlights and shadows, you can see I've got more of a highlight in the centre. It gets a little bit darker either side. This is a key part to establishing more of that shape. but the hair direction that I'm going to add on top is going to reinforce that further. Now if I make my pencil strokes too vertical or too horizontal, I'm going to either make the face look too tall or too wide. It will then have more of that flatter appearance. So all of my pencil strokes that I create here, even though it might just be very, very short little details and in some cases shading, I'm always following the way that that hair direction moves. This is going to really help to enhance that depth and realism when we can't add in lots of individual details to reinforce that further. Now getting the balance right with this is crucial, and it is going to vary depending on the length of the hair. If the horse is photographed more towards the winter months where they're getting their longer coat, this is obviously going to then extend the pencil strokes we need to create. This technique, when working with the pastel pencils, it can be applied to any subject. The Labrador coat, for example, the length of that is going to vary drastically to a German Shepherd. That would then be taken to the extreme with something like an Afghan Hound. So being able to adjust the length of the pencil strokes, the direction of the pencil strokes, and even the thickness of the pencil strokes is something that we should really focus on from the moment we start considering this layer in the drawing. Now the way that the highlights and shadows or the pencil details curve are relevant for all parts of the portrait. You can see here as I start the neck, I'm indicating that that curve of the muscle is in place right from the very first layer. I want to be making sure that I'm reinforcing that with each layer that I add. Now when drawing manes, the approach I like to use is going to be fairly similar regardless of the length of the hair. The one thing that will vary is the pencil technique, which I'll cover in the next few minutes. But starting off here, working out where my lights and my darks are again, I feel is going to make my drawing process much easier. Now when working on longer hair that does overlap, or even the shorter hair that's more tufty and then sitting above everything else, it can make it very confusing on knowing where to start. Now when I have that feeling of any drawing, regardless of what it is, I want to be simplifying that process as much as possible. Now in the real-time version of this tutorial, I show my preferred layering approach on how to make this step as easy as I can. I'm not considering my top highlights at all. Adding those in right now is going to add even more confusion. I want to be aware of them, but I certainly don't want to be drawing them at this stage. My initial focus is to get my base layer dark enough, and you can see here that I'm already indicating at the way that the hair changes direction. Now the mane of this horse is significantly shorter than something that had a mane down to the shoulders, but I would still block in my highlights and shadows as I am here, regardless of the hair length. Once I've done that, I can then start to focus more on the next layer, building in some of that texture before then finalising with my highlights. Now one of the very last elements to go on my portraits is always the whiskers. They are overlapping everything else, so I do like to leave those for my last layers. Now drawing long, fine lines, it can be quite challenging. One of my biggest tips here is to use light pressure and don't move the pencil too slowly. Having a real slow movement there can actually make the line look wobbly, where we're taking too much time. Now we don't want to rush it, it should just be more of a steady flow movement. It's going to help create more of that natural curve. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help if I can. And if you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this horse tutorial, I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.